Fantastic. Are we live streaming? Fantastic. Good morning. Hello, everyone. I am Susan Murray, and I am Director of the David Hume Institute. I am delighted to welcome you here to this launch event this morning to discuss our new report with Professor Duncan Maclennan about essential disruptions to the housing system. Now, before I hand over to our chair, I'd just like to confirm there are no fire alarms, so if the fire alarm does go off, please proceed to the nearest exit. Now, we are recording this event, and that's why the speakers have microphones. They do not work for amplification in the room, so if anyone is hard of hearing, please move closer to the front. And now, without further ado, I will hand over to Ellie, who is our chair for the day.
Thank you, Susan, and welcome to this morning's event. I've been really fortunate to see this project evolve over the last year or so, and even to be invited to take part in some of the roundtables as part of my day job with the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. So it really is fantastic to be here today to hear some of the report's conclusions. And I'm shortly going to pass over to Professor Duncan Maclennan to provide an overview of his report. And we're then going to hear some reflections from our panel, which I am sure will generate plenty of discussion. And I look forward to hearing this audience's questions and comments as well. Now, I don't think Duncan needs much in the way of introduction. But for those of you who are perhaps part of the uninitiated, I'll start with a very long biography. Duncan was awarded a CBE for services to UK housing research in 1997, and he remains affiliated to the University of Glasgow as an emeritus professor of urban economics, as well as holding professorial appointments in housing economics at McMaster University and the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Duncan was a member of the board of Scottish Homes from 1989 until 1999, and then spent a decade working in government as special advisor to the First Minister of Scotland, as a chief economist of Victoria, as chief economist in Canada's Federal Department for Infrastructure and Cities. And I'll take a deep breath for the next bit. Duncan has also acted as advisor to ministers in the UK, Scotland, France, Poland, Norway, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Academy of Social Sciences, and he's an honorary member of the Royal Town Planning Institute, the Chartered Institute of Housing, and the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. So as far as experience goes, I think we're in quite safe hands. But in all seriousness, I hope you will all agree that Duncan is something of a one-off. And given that he could work in any part of the world, we're incredibly fortunate that he's decided to focus his expertise on Scotland, because goodness knows do we need it. So Duncan, if you're ready, may I hand over to you?
Susan's warned me not to move from this podium because it ruins the filming, apparently, if I do. But I do like to wander, both metaphorically and physically, as I talk. Ellie, it's always wonderful to be at home here in Scotland for a while, and people always call me Professor Duncan Maclennan. In Canada, nobody uses the term professor because primary school teachers, any teachers in Quebec are called professor, so it's not regarded, well, it's an important title for everybody, but people don't use it. And over the last 2 months or so when I've been here, I've got used to my grandchildren referring to me as Chunky Donkey. I will take offence if any of you do that, because I'm trying my best and losing, but thank you for the introduction, and it was a great pleasure to do this piece of work. I just realised, Susan, we started the discussion here a year ago. I think when you're dealing with Scottish housing, This building is well named. It's Riddle's Court, and it's been a bit of a riddle over the last year working out where we are, what we're doing, and how we go forward. But
Duncan, fix the next slide. It still says starting soon.
oh,
And the next one.
go. Three. So you've got the title is Prosperity Begins at Home. It's on all 3 slides, okay? I should actually really start by thanking DHI and Susan for engaging with this and sticking with it and managing me over the last year. Apparently that's difficult. Also, I want to thank Jocelyn Fleming, who's here, not only for her insights about homelessness, but actually for reading stuff I was writing, trying to civilize it a bit, and did a great job helping me actually get the report finished. And of course, many of the people in this room contributed by giving their time, and in the case of CCG, thank you for giving your money as well. This was not an enormously generously supported project, and my daily rate has been roughly what I earned as a bus conductor in 1968. But I didn't do it for the money, as you can probably realise, but because I do think that housing systems in the Western world generally have become more problematic in the last 10, 20 years. And I think in Scotland, over particularly the last year, the year before, the Scottish system was going off the rails faster than anywhere else I know. I don't happen to think that's actually the case now, and I'll explain why. But I do think that we have tried to set out a number of points through this. We set out what the nature of the polycrisis was in the introduction here a year ago. I don't intend to go over that again. In the framing paper in May, we tried to outline a way that you have to think about housing, how it is not only complex, but it relates to so many things. There are so many drivers of the housing system. There's income, there's population, there's preferences. Increasingly, wealth is now a driver of the system, and we've not quite adapted how we think about our fiscal and other arrangements to deal with that. But we also were stressing that there are so many policy areas, policy levers that government pull that aren't called housing policy, that have huge effects on the housing system and are often not coordinated with what is called housing policy. And I think Scotland's a very obvious example of that, so that it's really important to think of housing as this kind of relational good or relational activity. And similarly, at the other end of the chain, in terms of housing outcomes, I think we've almost got a 1960s view of what housing is in government in Scotland. i.e. it's a merit good, it's about poor people, it's about disadvantaged. And it is about that, and it's a really important thing. But it has to be more than about that. We have to think about our housing expenditures as not just merely palliative, as I talked to Callum about before. In other words, making people's lives easier, all from when they're kids until they're almost not here at all. It's about preventative, so that good housing reduces bills in relation to health, in relation to education, in relation to skills training, I would argue as well. But there's a key productive element. Good housing built in the right places, affordable, has huge impacts, not just in jobs in the short term, but the economic functioning of the country. Now, that perspective is missing in thinking in Scotland. It's been missing for the 50 years I've been doing this work. And there's a huge resistance within the machine to actually thinking about it. And I think that costs us dearly. So that we tend to have arguments and discussions and emphasis in policy, which is about helping disadvantaged individuals and at places in decline. And yes, we have to do that, not abandoning that, but I'm saying, we want Scotland to grow, we want places to grow. For goodness sake, we've got to provide the right amounts of housing, the right varieties of housing at the right prices. And that's key, having a planning system that thinks about growth and economic growth, and be really explicit about that. And we don't need to add blue, green, or any other kind of label to it, but we actually have to have growth and productivity to achieve all the other objectives we're talking about. That's gone from discussions in housing policy. It's not gone from the discussions I have in housing policy in the Housing Ministry in Canada. It's a really important consideration there. It's an important consideration where I work in Australia. We've just missed it. And it's about how the machine thinks. It's about how the housing sector thinks. And it's about how the civil service is organised to think about housing. So I'm not being critical of individuals here. I'm critical about the way we've collectively not adapted our systems and our thinking to being in the 21st century and having to deal with complex economic change. And I'll come back to this point about a lot of the techniques we use to analyse housing systems and think about planning belong in the 1960s rather than in the 21st century. And I'm not saying we don't have planning. Of course we have to have planning. Of course we have to have these merit good policies. But we need to frame them in a rather different way. I hadn't meant to say any of that, but it gives you a background to how I've been thinking about this. We talked through in the introduction about the troublesome trinity, as I call it, and I won't go through that again, other than mention that the indicators are worsening, and we also, it's important to relate the adverse housing outcomes in homelessness, rent burdens, declining home ownership rates for the young, to the bigger missions. You know, not only the environmental mission, not only the social mission, but the economic mission. We've not made anywhere near enough progress on that latter set of concerns. So getting worse, not making the right connections still. And many good contributions from people in this room about making that stronger connections. The meta causes of all of this, just quite quickly. If you look at as needs have grown, in effect, as the bottom two deciles of the income distribution have fallen behind the average, and as housing costs have risen for every decile of the income distribution, but risen most rapidly for the poorest, merit good needs should have been increasing, but merit good provision in the sense of affordable social rented housing has been declining. So that's a moral decision. That's not, I try to be an economist rather than a political spokesperson, but I just point out that that's a moral political choice. And unless you change it, and change it somewhat more than we have, the poorer 20% of Scots are going to be left behind, further behind, unless we do that. So we might as well, no gaslighting about figures of affordable housing programs or ever, just look at the facts and see what's been left behind. And I think that's really important that we address that. But the other important point I was trying to make was to return to the theme of thinking about housing as a system. If you clutter up the private rental housing market, you make life worse for the poorest people. You put more pressures on them to find more social housing rather than market rented housing. If young people can't get into home ownership, that clutters up the private rented sector. It functions as a system. And in fact, the private rented sector is often the release valve for pressures in the housing system. It's grown unintentionally without any reframing of policy until, well, the last 10 years in different ways, as I point out. But that it makes a point about a system. But we also have to think of system in a different sense about how do we manage and how do we govern housing outcomes in Scotland? And there I think there are real weaknesses in the system of governance of housing in Scotland. In fact, I want to speak about that for 5 minutes at the end. So when we look at these things, there are two things to do here. One is be really clear about the needs commitment. Are you going to do it or not? And I know the housing lobbies here. I think you can improve your cases, and I've indicated how and why. But, well, good cases are made, but that's for politics to respond to, and no doubt you'll get some responses in the next 6 months. But beyond that, and beyond that resource issue, and we've got to go beyond that resource issue, is how do we disrupt the business of housing, the housing business as usual in Scotland? In other words, how do we shape a much more effective collaborative government? In other words, I want to go from making a mess to making amends, because I think that's where government has to do. It has been making a mess, it needs to make amends, and how do we do that? Well, within that, I think the emergency response from the Scottish Government has actually been reasonably good in the last few months, and you all know what these different elements are. I won't go through this, but I do think these were all useful measures to do, and I think that was a good start, but it can only be seen as a start. It doesn't, in my view, meet the needs requirement. I think probably you could double the affordable social housing budget and roughly meet the targets that people talk about. If you don't do that, you're not going to reach them. So let's be really clear on that and what the consequences might be. But in terms of disrupting the system, obviously it takes longer to do that. You have to think about it. You have to think about how you use your structures and institutions to do it. That doesn't happen quickly, and it doesn't happen in pre-election periods. So that a lot of what I'm saying, the 7 disruptions really are for the next Parliament to consider and discuss, as much as say they're committed to doing it before they get there. Because a number of them, particularly the area of tax change, which is essential, no party's going to put that in their manifesto, because people don't necessarily vote for tax increases. But at the end of the day, we are going to have to reform the tax system for housing in Scotland in different ways. And I think that's an issue for the Parliament and the political parties to actually take on board. I have to say, when I was writing this stuff, I thought, that may never happen, because I wasn't impressed by the politics of the Parliament generally in this area. I was at the Homes for Scotland conference last week, and Jane, I thought the politicians actually performed really well. I was quite impressed by that. And I think it's important to recognise talent in your politicians. I'll divert for a little moment here. When I was working for Donald Dewar, my responsibility was, I had 2 responsibilities. One was to look after Wendy Alexander, so I clearly failed. And the second was to make sure that the people of Glasgow voted to transfer their housing from the City Council to the Glasgow Housing Association, now Wheatley. In that process, there was a discussion with Donald and some advisors about a particular issue, i.e. dissident members of the Labour Party. And sometimes there are, as we see this weekend. And I was told, well, you should go along and speak to so-and-so and so-and-so and so. This is my job, to go and speak to members of MSPs and persuade them that transferring Glasgow's housing would be a good idea. And the head of the policy unit said, and go and speak to Madeline. And so I went and speak to Madeline. She was a dissident who believed in probably public ownership of the world, basically, starting from Coatbridge outwards. And so I went into this conversation with Madeline, and I said, well, Madeline, this is what we're really trying to do, blah, blah, blah. And I want to make my progress, but about 15 minutes, and she said, well, you have a point there. You have a point, son. I was younger then. She said, you have a point, son. And by the way, my name's Elaine. I hadn't realised she'd merely been described as Mad Elaine. So I do recognise talent in politicians. I usually try to be diplomatic, and don't anyone strike that from the recording, because she's still alive and might well sue me. Anyway, back to the 7 disruptions. We really need to. I've talked about the case about disruption in relation to the merit good already. Not going to repeat that. I think a critical thing is take a different view about the supply side strategy. Now, supply strategy is not all we have to think about. A lot of the mess in the rental market in Scotland in the last 6 or 7 years has been bad demand management in relation to numbers of students, numbers of people. And I'm not impressed by how this particular metropolitan area that we're in actually manages the demand side of the system. I think that's a real issue there. But certainly, we've got to look to a much more effective and responsive supply system. And I don't think this is all about short-term incompetence and intransigence of local authority planning officials, well, at least not everywhere. And it is interesting that the Scottish Government have not followed the example of England, nor indeed of Canada, of incentivising municipalities to speed up and resourcing the shift in planning speed. And I think that's something that's been missed out on the agenda here, and we've tried to deal with it by training more planners and through the improvement service. And I don't think that's necessarily going to have the impact that these schemes have had in Australia and Canada. So there's still an issue missing there. But above all, I think that making NPF 4 as workable in the short term is quite clear in speaking to people within a number of sectors in the industry, that if you believe in net zero as a single dominant objective of Scottish policy, NPF 4 is a great national planning framework in many regards. If you think there's any necessity of any kind of economic resource, economic future, economic change, including green economic change, I may say, or if you're trying to run the housing system, doesn't work. It blatantly does not work and has to be replaced. I would want to see something like a Scotland Homes and Places mission statement appearing from government and being reflected in a planning process I'll talk about a bit later on. But it identifies places that will grow. Who in Scotland ever puts out a statement about, here's the framework of places that are going to grow? I mean, in a sense, UK government have done that yesterday by announcing where new towns might well be. We shy away from that. We don't do that because it may reflect the inability of Parliament to take strategic spatial decisions. But we have to have a clear, if you're talking about the future of a country and its planning framework, you have to know where are the places and the regions and localities that you think will grow, as well as dealing with the places that decline. And I don't think that we do that within the framework. It's got to be a framework that's much more market informed. We have a view in planning still that we have a very controllable silo of activity and regulation here, and we're going to control this system. There's no real sense, I mean, in an intellectual sense, of how markets function, of what they know, of how you can use that knowledge, about how you can drive change. So that a lot of the things that Scottish Homes tried to embed in Scotland in the 1990s disappeared pretty quickly after it disappeared, so that we've reverted to a much more centralised view of what a land use planning system actually achieves. It doesn't have to be like that. It can be much more indicative, and it has to be, in my view, there's not much point in having a planning framework unless it's based on indicative infrastructure, housing, and other capital expenditures meshed into that framework. Otherwise, it's just an airy-fairy document of some principles that you then spend endless time in the courts challenging. And I don't think that's any way to run a railroad. Oh, we don't invest in railroads either, sorry. Any way to run a housing system. And I think some of the techniques within that, like the local housing system analysis, and I was one of the original authors, it's now used for purposes it was never meant to be used for. We wrote explicitly when it was being designed that you can't really use this in rural areas because the level of transactions are too thin, because it's based on looking at roughly how markets have been moving, but you can do that in big areas where there's a big sample of transactions. You can't use it. You've never been able to use it in rural areas. So Honda then assumes that we can do this. So you get the mess you get in the Highlands at the moment, and prospects of lots of jobs, none of them revealed through basically the key devices in the local housing planning analysis framework. That's what I'm saying. We've not moved on as the world has moved on in terms of thinking about change and how we cap it. So on the planning system, then clearly we can do much better, and I'll come back to that. But we also know we need to know more about auditing supply chains at subnational level. They're about shortages of skills, and Prosper did good work on that, shortages of materials, management capacity, support for SMEs. There needs to be an industry strategy, as there is in Canada, an industry strategy to develop modern methods of construction, to develop modular housing, because it gets treated too often as, well, it's just another way of building. Well, it is, but it operates in a different way and has different time horizons and different constraints and more upfront fixed capital, so that if you have an unpredicted and an unstable level of demand running through the system, you're not going to have a successful modern methods of construction sector. So an industry strategy, and I don't see any of that appearing in the Scottish context. Disruption, and I realise I'm taking too long, so I'm going to go much more rapidly here. We've got to address the issue of the falling age-specific home ownership rates for people under 40. Actually, age-specific home ownership rates are now falling for people under 50 in Scotland. That is really problematic. Some people say, oh, well, it's okay. We're living in a world where rental, it's a different world. No, it isn't. Home ownership has been the way we save, the way we provide for ourselves in old age, and the way that the majority of Scots actually save and accumulate an asset. We've not provided any other alternatives, so we have to fix that. And I think there's a range of measures that we can do that aren't actually discussed in policy, but any incentives have to be tied to new supply. Otherwise, they just make things worse for the next generation. And I do think the non-profit sector should be thinking about, are there rent-to-mortgage routes that people who live in that sector for 4 or 5 years as rents, if they're steady rent payers, if they're steady savers, can you think about how you flip over people's status from being a renter to being a homeowner? And I think that's particularly important for public sector workers in the cities who don't have high wages. I know Ken Ross at one of our seminars got very interested in nurses in East Lothian. I forgot to ask you any further about that, Ken, but was making the case that we don't think about these things. And I think there's something in that area that could be developed much more effectively. But on a modern rental market, I think where we are now on the rent control settings, I think you could make that system work, although we need to actually increase the knowledge base. The knowledge base for running rented housing in Scotland, given its proportion of the housing sector, is just absolutely disgraceful. You can't do any coherent analysis with what's there. The people that do work in this, academics that work on it, piece together things, I think, reasonably effectively. Otherwise, you only ever get the industry view. And in that ideological debate about private renting, having the industry view is not enough. You've got to have a much more balanced. I'm not suggesting it's always unbalanced, but it needs to be balanced in terms of what's there. But some of the details of that legislation, like the price index that you used, well, why use a CPI rather than a cost of letting rental index, price index? Why use local authorities to trigger a rent control area when we know that local housing markets straddle across local authority boundaries? That's just silly in terms of effective housing policy. And what about the local housing allowance? The costs of renting vary so much within local authority areas, or the areas for which the local housing allowance is designed. It actually inhibits development, particularly in the costlier areas of rural Scotland, where there are also towns in the same locality. So these are bits of the system that need to be developed. But leaving the avenue open to have commercial, if you like, large-scale landlordism, I think, is a really constructive element in the Scottish housing system, as long as it's well regulated. In Canada, there's a category of investment called purpose-built renting. Most of their rental sector is not buy-to-let landlords or people trying to just do that extra bit of speculation. It's big professional landlords, and it works quite well, and it actually works quite well in localities that have rent controls as well as not rent controls. So we could make this work if we fine-tune it adequately. There's various other things we should do. I think Purpose-built student housing may well have missed the peak if one reads stuff about universities, as I do. Maybe not necessarily an emphasis. I want to say something fairly quickly about the non-profit sector, not because it's unimportant. I think re-galvanising and rethinking what the non-profit sector can do in a housing system, Scotland's really lost it in the last 10 years. I'm astonished when I come back where there was a vitality of support, there was understanding within the civil service, basically, about what non-profits did. And a lot of that was down to the way in which Scottish Homes actually promoted non-profits. Once they disappeared, nobody promoted non-profits other than non-profits themselves. But then they just get seen as another lobby group. And in that context, I'd say two things. Don't try and force the community-based and relatively small associations dealing with the worst places in Glasgow to do something radically different, because they're doing a difficult job. They have been a difficult job for sometimes 50 years, but do mobilise the assets that they're sitting on top of and find out collaborative ways within that part of the sector, because there's a lot of built equity. I can tell you that the average HAG rate for housing association projects in places like Partick, where there's still now some pretty valuable properties, we're actually about 85%. So there's a lot of equity went in from the state. There's a lot of equity being created by the market. It's sat on, it's not used, it will have to be used in some effective way. So that's a question for the traditional sector where I think it should be supported. But the really big gain for Scotland is to think about the bigger non-profits in a different way. Give them much more diverse roles in middle market renting. Think about how they contribute to potential home ownership ladders. And I know some people in the sector think that's terrible, we don't do that. You have to accept that there are important middle market roles in owning and renting that nobody else is doing. I think that they have to look at other sources of income. I do admire some of the things that places where people did in England of actually running recreation centres and making money from them and subsidising some of their other activities. So that we should have a regulatory framework that allows our big non-profits to be truly entrepreneurial, to go for more diverse income sources. And it's not just recreation centres. When you go to rural Scotland, in some places you'll see great local initiatives where communities and community land transformations have quite often started generating electricity out of alternative energy sources. Why isn't there a much wider community-based energy descent program that actually uses non-profits that will actually generate resources for them that actually allows them to do different things? These things did not appear in Scottish Government thinking about inclusive growth, nor about the net zero transition. In other words, I think within the housing policy framing, housing associations, you deal with disadvantaged people and maybe some middle market rent. Not, hey, you've got capital, you've got local, you've got community. Some of you even have connections to capital markets. Some of you have professional boards. Some of you can do something quite different. I think that the next 5 years could be really transformational for these larger non-profits, and keep the non-profit emphasis by all means. But we've seen how different models, particularly given a bit of space, this is abandoning the old top-down silo model that you have to control to the last detail in a box-ticking kind of way what an organization does. That was for the last century. That's not how it happens now. You've got to allow development, you've got to allow innovation, you've got to allow evolution. And when I look at the framework, particularly for the larger organizations in Scotland, there's no space for them to grow or change. And I think that's a fundamental weakness in policy. Now, I'm going to get the evil eye fairly shortly. I should have probably had it a little while ago. I won't go into the question of modernising the taxation of housing. The council tax clearly needs to change. The state of the council tax reflects the absence of courage and prioritisation in Scottish politics over the last 30 years. It's a huge failure of the devolved settlement, which I hugely support, that it is where it is. The way in which the land and building transfer tax operate could also be reinvestigated. But there is now in all the countries I work, as people are searching for the resources for affordable housing programs, as they're searching for other resources, as we see the growing gap between younger generations and my generation, over 65s in Scotland have 75% of the housing wealth. They'll say, well, we deserve that. We say, no, we didn't. We lay in our beds sleeping. Well, most people were sleeping. And we accumulated, I've done some back-of-the-envelope calculations, about 65% of the wealth of my generation that they own in housing, 2/3 of the wealth they have. They didn't pay for it through their mortgages. They got it through the market failure of rising prices. So I think that in Canada and Australia, this has become a very active conversation. Fiscally, we can't afford to tax incomes anymore. We can't take any more public debt. So where do we look to for, in a sense, rebalancing this system? Because my view is that the left behind younger people will start joining the left behind communities in terms of public disaffection about mainstream politics. So when I say if politics doesn't change housing, my goodness, these housing outcomes will change politics, and we're already beginning to see that. And it's really critical that younger people who are not of, let's say, a reformed point of view, it's getting really confusing, that we certainly hope they don't begin to lean in that direction. But if politics is untidy about this, it's going to make politics a mess. So that needs to be done. Finally, and I'll do this as quickly as I can, I said that we have to think of a system of government. Scottish government takes its housing policy decisions without any direct consultation with the UK government. There's been a huge failure in cross-order of government collaboration right from the outset of devolution. We had a 2040 strategy for a system that's at least 2/3 in the market, in which there's no discussion about what tax policy would be. In other words, you can't think about Scotland's housing future without trying to think what the UK is going to be doing in taxation, debt, public expenditure and the like. There needs to be at least 2 annual meetings of a UK Housing Council. And UK government are at fault in this, where Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, I'm not talking about involving it in the devolved structures in England that are appearing. These are these are devolved entities with some fiscal powers, and they need to be coordinated and they need to be much better done. Secondly, within the Scottish Government, we should be creating a housing infrastructure, place and planning ministry. Bring together housing and infrastructure, because it is infrastructure. Relate it to place issues, because every time you build a house, you're building a place. And you also have to relate it to planning. So housing H, I, infrastructure, P, place, join them all at the hip, I say, and have a ministry that effectively deals with this, because we don't deal with it effectively. And I know there's resistance to this idea within the civil service, and I think they're wrong, and I think need to be told they're wrong, as I've just done again. In this context, the Scottish Government also have to have a whole of government policy here. And maybe the Deputy First Minister should be chairing annually a discussion about where spending is going in other departments and how it relates to the housing outcome. Until the emergency, so-called, the polycrisis as I would call it, is over, I think there should be some cross-government department collaboration about the housing outcomes of non-housing programs. Because if you don't do that, you're doing something that's isolated. You leave a housing minister left out there in the field with an inadequate programme to deal with issues that are being partly created by other Scottish Government departments, and that doesn't make sense to me. Within that, I do think we need to, when Scottish Homes got scrapped, I saw that. I'd been on the board for 10 years, but I saw it happen when I was advisor to the First Minister, who wasn't particularly inclined to do it, but there was politics, of course, involved. But what did get lost were two things. A connection between communities down there and the First Minister's office, if he wanted them to, through a very active and extensive agency. But what really got lost at the top level was having a group of skilled professionals in the housing area in terms of finance, market analysis, housing policy thinking, scanning what was happening in the wider world. And I think that capacity needs to be restored because it does not seem to exist within the machine to any significant scale at the moment. And I would place that, and I'm sorry, I see Tony Rose in the room. Tony, this isn't personal, but I would boost the capacity of the Scottish Futures Trust as the only real thinking entity in Scotland on these kinds of issues, to actually do that and advise the government much more forcefully on housing issues. Beneath that, I think the government has to devolve strategic powers about housing and infrastructure, the budgets for them, and the way that the discussion about the skills budget being decentralised to regional economic partnerships or whichever is the most appropriate entity, actually to devolve these budgets to that scale. And I think the budgets should not reflect the patterns that they are now, that's pretty much as they were in the 1990s, but actually begin to think about negotiating something of the flavour of housing and investment partnership deals. Learn some of the very positive lessons out of the City Deal framework, which leaves scope for innovation, but also gives much more control to a decentralised level. I would not decentralise that to individual councils, but actually in the structure, I think it's really important to create two things. Sitting the regional economic partnerships, as the way the City Deals did in England, should actually encourage the formation of combined housing authorities. I think there are too many housing authorities in Scotland and planning authorities at that scale. Combine these functions into combined housing and planning authorities at the regional scale, and within them, sitting beside them, I would actually have regional housing supply councils that would have the private sector and developers auditing the supply chains within these localities, looking at skills, not only looking at what the problems are, but making recommendations about how the regional economic partnership has to unblock them. In other words, get a much better alignment of the different things that impact the housing supply chain and move on towards effective management of that system. I've got a lot to say in this, well, I've got to say in everything, but a lot to say in this in particular, but I've pushed my luck already. I think that MSPs and political parties need to put Scotland fight your election any way you want, but once you get there, it's really important that you put Scotland's housing and other interests before political wedge interests. And it's really critical that that happens. They have to do in a parliament that's much more collaborative than it is now. Actually, Parliament is a lot less collaborative than in the first 4 years where I worked within it. And it needs to be collaborating about delivering a housing system for the many, as I would say, not just a few. That was an old-time political phrase, but it's actually a good one. In doing so, they can raise the hopes and realities, I think, of the left-behind places and meet the aspirations of Scots that aren't yet 40. But we can also put in place a system that actually allows effective organisations to grow, but also allows Scotland to grow. Thank you. Sorry, Al.
Thank you, Duncan. There was a huge amount to digest in all of that. And so to help us make sense of, to help us understand some of the points that Duncan made, I'm going to invite our panel to join us at the front to give some short reflections. And so from the far side of the room, working towards me, we're going to welcome Jane Wood from Homes for Scotland, Ken Ross from RDR Limited, Callum Murray of CCG Scotland, Callan Chomchuk from CIH Scotland, and Anne Leslie from La Housing Trust. So just as a reminder, the microphone isn't for amplification in the room, but for those online. And Jane, can I invite you to give your comments first?
Yeah, I'm quite glad, because that means if I go last, I'm sure lots of people will be saying the same thing. Look, there's an awful lot to unpick here, we welcome this in-depth and much-needed research. I think it's really important that where we are now in a housing emergency that we're not seeing the end of, that we have that important knowledge share and that understanding of what is driving this housing emergency, which, as Duncan has well documented, is a long time in the making. It's been around for far too long. So we welcome it. A lot of the details in the report we share. At Homes for Scotland, we represent 90% of people that build houses, both private developers, social landlords, and of course, importantly, the small and medium-sized market as well. So we have got a manifesto for government. It has been well informed, and Duncan has informed that as well. So I'm not going to go through the asks, but they very much mirror a lot of the asks that Duncan has said, and I'll pick up a little bit more detail in where we might slightly differ. So I think we agree very much that government, and in particular the Scottish Government, have failed to connect an economic and a productivity story, and therefore have failed to create a functioning system. I think that is a fair comment. The commercial, there is a question as well of housing having sat in a social ministry, and therefore maybe not being around that commercial and economic awareness, both in the skills that are delivering that in the Scottish Government and just the general awareness. We do welcome in the Scottish Government, and we've been working very closely, Barry White, the co-chair, is here today, the work of the National Strategy for Economic Transformation Board, who have picked up housing and looked at it very closely as being a contributor and an inhibitor to our economic growth in Scotland, and is actually within the Scottish Government, holding government to account through data. That feels quite joined up, which is good. I think housing is really underestimated as an economic driver, and it suffers and Duncan talks about this much more eloquently than I do, but it suffers the consequences of enormously disjointed policy making, and it definitely feels more like a stick than a carrot, I think, for everybody that's in this sector. And that in turn means it's not underpinned by relevant and contextual data. You know, we in suppose 3 years, I think data has been driving everything that we've been. Is that not working?
It's just
Okay, good job I've got a loud voice. So is that better? Can everybody hear me? Is that all right? One of the things that when I came in, and I don't come from the sector, but I think I was slightly shocked at the lack of data. But I was more concerned about how data was used in housing. And, you know, we've got an example. Scottish Government will use a figure here. This is just an example. There's 164,000 homes with consent that could be built now. So why are we in a housing emergency? When you use headline data like that, it's very dangerous because it misinforms, and therefore you end up not getting the right changes in policy made. And when you look at 164,000 houses with consent, you can see there are over 10 years of local development plans, or 5 years. They're not available now. And when you analyse data like that, which is what we must get smart at doing, there are probably 80,000 houses that could be built now. But even those, when you analyse those further, are held up by such complex issues, which might be commercial viability, there might be issues with SEPA. They are very broad and vast, and some come back, of course, to local planning regimes and resource. So data is really important, and what we do know is we still need to understand the need in Scotland. What is the housing need? And in this job, I'm frequently asked by peers and friends and family, is it about supply? Why do we need more houses? Because it feels when we walk on our pavements in this country that there are houses going up all over, but there are not enough. We are running out of houses. And I think it's really important, and we have launched a public campaign. We feel so strongly about this, that if civic society does not engage in the issue of housing, we are not going to move the dial with our politicians. We're 8 months off an election. We feel that civic society and the perceptions of housing are so skewed that we are not getting the right dialogue and conversation with opinion formers and those that matter. Because we know 1 in 4 people in any given community will be having some form of housing need within their household. And that will be across whether it's an elderly person not getting the home they need, a young person living at home. It exists for all. So yeah, so I think the other things I just wanted to pick up was the policy, the need for civic society to be engaged, the gap, and Duncan picks this up, between the haves and the haves not is widening, which is remarkable, isn't it? When you think in Northern Ireland, if you think of those gaps and that need, Northern Ireland in opinion polls, housing is number 1. It's the number 1 for the voters, above education and health and cost of living. In Scotland, it's down at 4 or 5. And one of the things we want our public campaign to do is to engage, is to engage and get it up the agenda. And everybody in this room has a role to play in that. So yeah, it's a concern. So I think the thing about the localization, I think, is or the regional structures. I would like us to ask the question, Duncan, in terms of the context of where we are now, because we are 8 months off an election. That's a big ask. It's a big change. We need system change. We need governance change, and we support it. But it would be good for others in the room just to unpick that a little bit more in terms of the timing of that, because have we got the cultures in local authority? Have we got the leaders, the right leaders in place? And we need to look at what we might look like, what our government might look like going forward after the 2026 elections. I think we need to reflect on what's possible. We've been told categorically by both the Permanent Secretary and the Cabinet Secretary that there is likely to be a change in terms of where housing sits or creating new structures ahead of that. We are in a housing emergency, so I think we need some short-term effective solutions. And when I say short-term, that doesn't mean a sticking plaster, because I think if we can do it short-term, we can do it long-term. I think we need targets. We need that. I'm using a Labour term, but I don't mean to be political. We do need to be mission-led very much. We've asked the government, because if they don't understand this sector, they don't understand what drives supply, then we're not going to get governments operating at the zenith of their capability. So we've asked for a state of industry report. We do it for other industry sectors in the Scottish Government. We need them to understand the markets, the economy and the commercialisation of what drives the supply. It's really important. And we've had that. Is that to try and stop me speaking? We've actually had that. We've now progressing that with Scottish Government, so we welcome it. And we welcome, I have to say, Duncan put up a slide at the beginning in terms of what has progressed, the new Cabinet Secretary. We do welcome a lot of the stuff, but my gosh, there needs to be a lot more done around the detail on that, on the timescales, and how is it going to be delivered. And let's remember, we have a minority government. We have the Verity House Agreement. We have those challenges between central government and local government, which are real, specifically, of course, for us in the planning regime. So I think I'm going to stop there. Is that my 3 minutes? I think I'm going to stop there. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane. So Jane's very in demand today, and we'll have to dash off. So I'm going to ask Jane to hand the microphone over to Ken to give his responses. I'm going to ask our panelists to keep their initial responses quite short, because we're going to have plenty of time for questions from the audience. There'll be opportunity to come back in then. But Ken, thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start by, first of all, thanking Duncan for giving of his time to produce this report, dividing himself between 3 continents and taking the time to meet with different interest groups to engage, challenge, and then produce a report that's honest, realistic, and offers a multidisciplinary way forward to meet the housing needs of our communities has been a gargantuan undertaking, and thank you. I hope lawmakers and policy advocates will adopt its proposals, because I believe this report could change the housing outcomes for generations to come in Scotland. It is a multidisciplinary piece of work that identifies a polycrisis. Wow, a truth that is self-evident but rarely heard among the many silos of the Scottish housing policy environment. And he advocates that it is essential that there is a link between housing and the economy. Housing should not just be a side issue of social policy. Same old will not do. Duncan argues that a bold system-wide reform is essential. Having been involved in this sector for over 50 years, I couldn't agree more. The position we're in now is one which, quite frankly, frightens me, because we are not meeting the needs of our communities, and especially the needs of the younger generation. Housing requires to be treated as essential economic infrastructure. This is an evidence-based change of policy being advocated. Canada and Australia have adopted such an approach with good outcomes: more homes. We need more homes, and we need them now. We do not need more fine words from politicians or further endless consultations. All political parties and politicians can agree on one housing issue, that we have a housing supply problem. However, we have total disagreement on how to sort this lack of supply. We need action now. Leaders need to take responsibility now, because we now have a generation who cannot afford to buy and do not qualify for socially rented housing and cannot rent a house because of the lack of supply or price. And there is an anger when I speak to people, young people, about housing. They feel the unjust nature of the current situation. Nobody is listening to their needs and their requirements. This is not a want or a desire, it is a need. It is an essential requirement to put a roof over the heads of our younger community. Most of these young people are key workers, and they're essential for economic growth. Within every community, there is a shortage of key workers. Whether they are care workers in Achilty-Buie, Edinburgh or Kelso, I could go on, NHS staff in Elgin, building trades operatives in the Highlands, police staff in Inverness. A lack of homes for these people is holding back both productivity and economic growth. I'm tired of hearing about a skills gap. Yes, it exists, but more importantly, we have a people shortage, key workers, and most of them need a home to rent. They need a roof over their head, not fine words. We need to translate strategic intent into operational reality. Recently, the Housing Investment Task Force produced a report which is accepted in full by the Scottish Government, and it also advocated that housing should be treated as critical infrastructure. They also advocated that investment in rental housing should be encouraged and facilitated to address the financial institutions becoming delivery agents, just as Duncan has advocated. 5 things are required to deliver homes and housing: land, infrastructure, all the necessary consents, funding and finance, and leadership. It's the last 2 that's in greatest shortage: funding and finance and leadership. The Scottish Government has made it clear that it cannot provide the funding necessary to meet our housing needs. We therefore need to encourage and facilitate the private sector to harness their funds to invest in rental homes in Scotland. For this, we need certainty and clarity. The government recently struggled to get the housing bill through Holyrood. We need new policies to address the housing crisis. I hope the First Minister and his entire cabinet will read Duncan's report and start to translate into operational reality by first treating housing as critical economic infrastructure. I agree with Duncan's conclusion. Housing can become the foundation of Scotland's prosperity, stability and fairness. However, if we do not sort out our housing needs, Scotland will not prosper.
So we'll now hand over to the first of our Callums on the panel, so Callum Murray from CCG.
Good morning. Duncan Maclennan, Professor Duncan Maclennan, was an inspired choice by the David Hume Institute, and CCG agreed to fund it. Sorry, it wasn't more, Duncan. But, you did say you would have done it for nothing. Maybe the next one. Hopefully there won't be a need for a next one. But we funded it without hesitation because this man has got a local and national and an international reputation. Outstanding in his field, an advisor to Dewar and to Brown. My goodness, Scotland is fortunate indeed to be blessed with this intellect, and we have to use it. Our politicians need to listen. They absolutely need to listen in a period of crisis. He's identified that housing is a key economic infrastructure. Better housing, better access to housing, supports our economic productivity, our prosperity, our health and well-being, and absolutely it supports social stability. Ken says he's worried. My goodness, look at the period that we're living in. Building over 1,000 homes annually, CCG welcomes the Scottish Government's recent call to action. We will engage with the requisite urgency, the ambition and the collaboration that they call for. These are going to be our drivers, absolutely our drivers. We'll push it forward. But real drive, as Ken has identified, it must come from the government. That leadership stems from the very top. Intent and investment and innovation has to flow with it. They have to support all of these factors at national and, as Duncan recognises, at local levels. Funding aside, proof that they're up for it lies in their desire to free the bottleneck that is the planning system. I'm into short-term fixes. Emergency is about doing things quickly. It's about a call to action. It's about moving forward. Our planning system must be the easiest hit in terms of finance and practicalities that the government could challenge. Where else could they make such an impact? Of all the changes, it's the cheapest, the most necessary, and will indeed have the greatest impact for me. Then again, I would say that, but I'm at the sharp end, at the front end. Thank you.
Thanks, Callum. And then we'll move on to our second Callum on the panel from CIH.
Thank you, Callum Squared. So yeah, great to be here this morning to talk at the launch of David Hume and Duncan's report. It's a bit like a golden age of housing policy and research, I think. And I know as we approach elections, it always gets like that. But you know, already this year we've had Prosper's rival report, Duncan's report this morning, CIH, SFHA and Shelter published our research on affordable housing supply earlier, just last week. In the summer, there was research on adaptations. Cash continually putting out research and great insight. So there's so much there. There's so much insight and evidence. And I guess I'll keep my remarks brief, but the challenge we've got in this room and across the sector is it could almost be too much at times. How do we make sense of it? How do we pull it all together? Because no one organisation, no one agency, no one part of the housing system has all the answers. We can't. You know, CIH, we talk about ourselves trying to be in the centre of the housing system as much as possible. But anyone knows CIH, our members are mostly working in the social sector. Our heart is about trying to deliver more social and affordable housing. So how do all of us in this room and across the sector actually be open to challenge, open to debate, and not necessarily a slave to what our members are wanting, but look at that systems-wide approach? So I guess the challenge to all of us today and with Duncan's report is, how do we take this conversation out of this room? How do we speak to officials Because that's really where it starts. How do you speak to politicians, officials about what the recommendations are? Because so David, I think you mentioned there about the report recommendations accepted in full. There's always a danger in that. A government recommendations are accepted in full, and then as if we move on past it. Actually, what we want is challenge and critique. Someone to say, I don't agree with that, but I do agree with that. How do we sequence that? And that's where we need to go, both with officials, with politicians and the sector. And I think if we can get that debate, that discussion, we won't get everything, but we have that honest discussion up to and crucially after the next election, then we can build on some of the successes that we have had in the kind of the Housing Emergency Action Plan. So I think there's a lot in the recommendations. I'm not on top of them in enough detail to go into them, but there's a lot of challenge for CIH, as there is for everybody in this room. I don't think there's anybody in this room who can accept everything Duncan said there wholeheartedly, and I think if you say you can, you probably haven't looked at it in detail. So it's up to all of us to look into it and understand what do we think that means and have that honest discussion between ourselves and then with politicians and decision makers. Otherwise, we'll be here in 5 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Callum. And last but not least, Anne Leslie.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Duncan, for your report and for inviting me here today. So I'm delighted to see housing as an economic driver and also your proposals for significant governance reform. I find myself, as Jane has predicted, as fifth in the line, and everybody has said most of what I was going to say. So there are a couple of points that you made that I would particularly like to pick on and explore. So the first one was you made a comment that we would need to double the budget for affordable housing in order to solve the housing emergency. And I absolutely agree. Building houses has probably about doubled in cost over the last 5-6 years through a number of factors. So the amount of money that the government has to put into affordable housing does need to increase. But also the government needs to think about spending its money differently. So Lar Housing Trust, which I'm the CEO of, was set up to build housing with low interest rate loan and no grant. So there is no grant required for our housing. And we were set up 10 years ago for that. Roll forward 10 years, and we've build affordable housing with low interest rate loan, which is cross-subsidised or which cross-subsidises commercial debt. So if the government can look at different ways of funding affordable housing in addition to grant, then our money could hopefully go further. The next point I'd like to briefly explore is that you see a very much more enhanced role for Scottish Futures Trust in delivering or leading on the finance, the partnerships and the innovation. Former employee of Scottish Futures Trust and LAR came out, it was devised by Scottish Futures Trust. But I think that is an extremely interesting way forward. Clearly down south we have Homes England, which has more of a Scottish Homes role, the role that you seem to be seeing for SFT. It might be quite an easy thing to say, give more powers to SFT, but actually on the ground that requires quite a change in authority, in controls, how it relates with SNIB, with the More Homes team, but I definitely think a closer working relationship and partnership so that we have one body that does regulate the whole sector, or not even regulate, but bring together the whole sector would be beneficial. Just final point I'd like to make is there are a number of housing associations across Scotland. Before like Jane, I don't have a housing background. I've been in it for 10 years and I have been absolutely blown away by the commitment, the thought, the ethos, the culture in housing associations, how they really do want to help their tenants. Tenants always come first. And so you made the point about a recreation centre helping to cross-subsidise housing. A lot of them do that already, but they get no kudos for that. They get no support for that much of the time. LAR, we're going to open our first cafe in 2 months' time. So there is a lot of that going on, and I think the more support that could be given to that, the more recognition, the more governance allowance of that, because quite often you're restricted, be it to set up a subsidiary company in order to do that, then the better. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. So Jane, I know you're going to have to leave us, so... Okay, that's great. I was going to say final thoughts before you go. But what we're going to do for the next part of our session is open up to comments and questions from the audience. We're going to rearrange some chairs at the front because we're also going to invite Duncan and Jocelyn to join the panel. So we're going to be nice and crowded at the front, but that's because we've got lots of great views to cover. So I'll invite Duncan and Jocelyn, and we'll just get ourselves a little bit more organised. We're nice and cosy. Is that okay, Susan?
Duncan, you need to get cosy or you're not on camera.
So if Duncan can cozy up to the rest of the panel.
And then when we don't get to talk, just
Yeah.
you're not on camera.
Okay. And we might rearrange again as we go, but do bear with us. So Susan has the roaming microphone, and I'm going to be led by Susan. She knows this audience well, who to pick on perhaps, who might have some provocative comments. Please use the microphone and introduce yourself before you begin.
Thank you, Gordon McRae from Shelter. I think fundamentally, just wanted to welcome the report. I think Callum Chomsik hit the nail on the head. There's some sleeper agents in this report that I think people who have just welcomed it, maybe it'd be good to unpack. I mean, I think it's very significant to have Ken and Callum Murray welcoming reform of property tax that's in here. So what does that look like? What does that, how do we start to address the available capital that's already, the wealth that's been created in there? And then the other kind of key bit for me is, we have seen a lot of policy debate, we have seen a lot of activity, but the capacity of government to actually make change does seem to be one of the biggest barriers. Even where they agree, their ability to actually implement that is something else. So I always think the best research warrants the question of what's the next bit of research. So the question to the researchers, to Jocelyn and Duncan, is what's next in terms of actually helping government deliver this? This is what they need. This is the way we need to get to, potentially. But how do they actually help a government who I think are now incapable of designing change themselves to actually design the steps that they need to go through to change that?
So Duncan, if you want to take it away, and Jocelyn.
I think that the next piece of work in research, and we'd intended to do it in this project because it was a bit underfunded, we didn't, is to actually write the economic narrative, bring together most of the evidence about how housing outcomes in Scotland damage productivity actually appears. Thanks, Ken. I've been shouting at students of classes of 400 people for most of my life. So if the microphone's too loud, I think most of the evidence lies in really well-funded work in the health sector, really well-funded work in the education sector, in analysing financial flows, savings and the like, that's not apparently really done by anybody at the moment. Housing research, as you say, there's a lot about Callum, but most of it is collecting together what other people have done, usually in other places. And I think that there's a lack of certain key Scottish-specific stuff, so that on that, there's definitely some things that could go forward. In terms of change, I'm old enough to remember three major periods of crisis in Scottish housing. One was the second half of the 1970s, after the first oil shock and the Barber house price boom. House prices rose by 22% in 1973 in the UK. And in that context, the party that reacted in terms of thinking differently was actually the Labour Party, who said, council housing is not going to cut it, pushed the notion of housing associations and really committed to developing low-cost home ownership. If you look at the Green Paper on housing policy for Scotland, I think 1977 or 78, it was quite radical and almost all of these things, reinforced, of course, by the fact that the Conservative government did actually drive the system in some of these directions. But right up until the early period of devolution, these strands were running through policy in a really substantial way, and particularly the support for the non-profit sector. And I think that that paid off then, it could pay off now. The other big radical shift was the attempt by the Dewar administration to encourage large-scale stock transfers. And Glasgow had a housing crisis in the 90s, which if we hadn't dealt with it, would have actually absorbed roughly 25% of the Scottish housing budget for 10 years to fix the problem. That was a radical and sometimes often politically resisted process, but there was completely different thinking about how you dealt with it. That's why I think we need to think differently. This question about the interaction between housing policy and economic development, there were 3 meetings between the chair of Scottish Homes and Scottish Enterprise in the mid-90s. They were held over rather nice dinners, and I was there. And the discussion was, yes, we need to do this. There's no point in going out to a remote hillside on the edge of Glasgow with crumbling public housing and say, let's spend 150,000 per house doing this up. And the chair of Scottish Homes at that time used to say, that's all very well, but what's this place for? And meaning, what's the economic function of the place? People refused to answer the question then, and they still don't answer the question. So we can see change, and I'm not entirely without confidence that we might see change. Oh, sorry.
I think it's both. I can offer you some hope. I mean, I remember many years ago going out with the Chief Executive of the City Mission in Glasgow to look at the city situation, and it appalled me. And at the end of that dreadful evening, I asked him, what can I do? And he said, Ken, more than anything else, get more homes built. That will help the homeless and the less able within our society. So over the years, I've been working on this. And like LAR, we deliver affordable homes without government subsidy.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. Could you just hold the mic
Oh,
up?
fine. Okay.
We'll get it on the live stream.
Is that any better? Okay. We've worked with pension funds, local authorities, to facilitate the delivery of mid-market rental homes without any subsidy. And one we did recently was with East Lothian, 50 mid-market rental homes targeting the lower end of the income sector. Got the houses built, Co-op owned them, local authority were leasing them, managing them. We facilitated and organised the whole thing. I asked the housing manager, where do the majority of the people work? Turned out about 95% of them worked in the care sector. And then as a direct result of putting roofs over the heads of these heroes, the Care Commission in East Lothian were able to put together care packages that unblock beds in the NHS. Direct result of investment in housing, improved productivity in the NHS. And that community benefited without a penny of government subsidy. So we've then worked with the Housing Investment Task Force and the pension funds who wish to invest in Scotland, invest at scale, a well-managed, well-organised, as Duncan was suggesting, we must have it well-managed and well-organised so tenants' rights are respected. But the private sector does want to invest, but it needs to be actively encouraged and facilitated. When we had the rent freeze, Patrick Harvey backdated the legislation. Now that is Constitutional Law 101 stuff. You never backdate legislation. What happened? £4.2 billion in Scotland was a red pen went through it. We have to actively create an environment where investment will flow into the country. We will get the homes, we'll get some of the homes that we need. And it is, but we must have stability, we must have certainty.
In terms of taxation, I'd need to defer to others on taxation.
Question on taxation for those who might not have picked that up from within the room. So anyone on the panel wanting to tackle that one?
I would just point out that whether you're talking about a rent control or financing social housing, I think you need to see the specific proposal. There are some housing taxation proposals which would not improve outcomes at all. There are others. None of them exist on the table in Scotland at the moment. There are some that have been developed by quite clever people in England. John Mulbauer at Nuffield College in Oxford is one of the UK's most distinguished economists, and he's produced a proposal where the effects of the tax and taxing a degree of capital gains in the process would actually increase housing output, and the incidence of the tax would largely fall on the two top deciles of the income distribution. So it's very difficult, I think, to answer the question about tax unless you're looking at specific proposals.
So I think Jane had a quick comment before leaving.
Just on tax and on general, I think anything that's done, and I don't know the specific on property tax, we spend an awful lot of our time analysing the intended and unintended consequences of regulation and policy. The cost of regulation for housing is prohibitive now. We've added up for a small, medium-sized builder, and remember, we've lost 40% of these house builders in the last 5 to 10 years. It costs an extra £30,000, the existing consultation that's on the table now, onto the price of a house. And I think, so whilst we've got the New Deal for Business, we were very involved in the Business Regulatory Impact Group at the Scottish Government. That's all really welcome. But when you do something over there, you have to look at what because there's a tipping point somewhere. So that's all that I would say is don't do it in isolation, do it in looking at the whole landscape. And I must go, and I'm going to ask my colleague for Home and Scotland, David, to take my place, if that would help. No, that's fine.
We haven't got everyone on screen at the moment.
Oh, right, okay.
Justin can take the seat you're sitting in.
Right.
Really
Oh, Justin can do that.
And
then David will pick up.
If there's anything specific from the audience we need David to pick up, we can do that.
Thank you, James. We've got another question from the floor, and we'll let Jocelyn play musical chairs as well. So I think Susan had a question lined up.
Thank you. I'm Anamika. I'm from Scottish Property Federation and agree with all the proposals that you said there. And it's really hard to disagree, actually. So I think one of the things which I really am keen on is how to move the mindset, because as you said, housing is looked at as a social issue, and it is, but it's also an economic driver, but it's a mindset and behavioral change that we need throughout from top to bottom as well. So how do we get the planning authorities to recognize viability when they look at developer profit as a very bad word? It's not a bad word, it gets reinvested. There have been recent cases where 1% profit is considered profit, it's not. It's maintaining your business and and also how to deliver all tenure of housing, not just focusing on the social side of it, would be my question.
So a question about changing mindsets, about how we view profit, and about taking a kind of cross-tenure approach.
I'll get into trouble here with my former employers. The economic content that goes into training postgraduate planning students has decreased substantially over the last 20 years. I think that there are some American universities where you don't get a postgraduate planning qualification of a particular kind unless you also do a course in development economics, i.e. the economics of development of property. And I do think that that's part of the reason is that planning has changed its perception of what it is, and it understands less about economics and markets than it did 20 years ago. I'm not having a go at planners. I've had a useful, constructive discussion with many of them over a long period of time. But I think in the Scottish context, there's been planning lost a huge amount of power within local government by the end of mid-1990s onwards. They've slightly restored that position by being the experts in sustainable development. So actually getting them to think about many other things is actually really quite difficult. I'm sorry, that's a bit blunt, but...
And does anyone else on the panel want to come in on that mindset question?
If I could.
With the microphone, please.
Development economics is something which, when you talk to local authority planning officials, you can actually hear the roaring in their ears. They don't want to know about such matters. But if you're going to be delivering homes, it's got to be viable for the organisation delivering them. And if you keep on adding, as Jane said just before she left, £30,000 per house to address, future and issues and requirements. I mean, we're talking in this city about delivering affordable homes to people who will be living in the city. But for every affordable home that's built, there's an educational contribution that has to be paid for by the developer. The kids are already at a school in the city. We're going to be putting just a new roof over their head. We don't need to build any more schools, but there's a financial cost to every new affordable home that gets built in this city for education. This is the nonsense. There is not a clear understanding of development economics because it is not taught properly.
Callum had a very, very quick comment to make on that question before we go for another from the floor.
So, absolutely good point from Ken and Jane. I think we also need to be mindful. We talk about regulations. We talk about these are people's lives. We're Ken, you made the point about actually providing kind of high quality homes for carers in East Lothian. They need to be of a standard. They need to be a quality. That's what gives people the foundation for life. So absolutely, let's look at things, look at detail, but we can't. I would be very reticent. We just need to find ways to deregulate and take costs out of the system because it's not making things viable. I think Gordon's point earlier around actually looking at the totality of the tax base has got to be where we look at, instead of we're looking at the existing model of how we deliver housing. And I think we're going to get into trouble if we start trying to pull out things here and there. This is a systems-wide approach. Housing to 2040 set out breaking the link between housing and wealth. An amazing statement, and clearly we've not delivered on that. So we do need to look at things in the round. And the challenge, and I said it in my first remarks, is actually trying to work together on this instead of saying we're providing too much of that, this isn't viable. We all need to be more open-minded around actually how do we build a better system and work with politicians. I'd worry if we start getting to a bit of inter-sector fight over that's not good enough, that's not good enough. If we can try and move away from our own existing priorities, then we've got a better chance in delivering the vision, Duncan's report.
Thank you. So the microphone's already been deployed in the audience, so we'll take a question here, and I know Jocelyn will come back with some comment when we get there.
Hi, Jason McGilt from Blackwood Homes and Care. We specialise in housing for people with physical disabilities and independent living. Thanks, Duncan, and the panel for your contributions. It really struck me, notwithstanding the last little intro change, about the consensus in the room and the insights about the boldness that we need to tackle these systemic changes, and the juxtaposition between that and just last week, down the road, our parliamentarians were spending hours and hours talking about clauses and amendments to the current housing bill. Some reasonable changes. Let's allow pets in social housing took a good couple of hours. The juxtaposition of the need with a housing bill, the first housing bill after the national housing emergency was announced, is so far off the scale of ambition that we need, it seems to me. And it worries me. On a specific, the Scots, do we need new Scottish homes, or through this future stress? I often am slightly wary of what we really need right now is another Quango. However, a focused delivery vehicle with the remit and that kind of spatial economic remit, it seems to me it's more than time for that. And just last observation, I was really struck by Duncan's comment about, this sort of systemic housing failure may lead to very significant political change, particularly in younger people who just can't get any kind of housing, never mind a job that pays to pay the rent. So my question is why is there this absence of courage? Why is there such timidity down the road?
So lots there. I'm going to ask our panel to keep answers nice and short so we can ask more questions. So that was about the idea of having a national delivery vehicle and some commentary about political decision making as well. So Duncan, if we could start with you perhaps.
On the national delivery vehicle, I deliberately avoided in the report saying we should reinvent Scottish homes. I don't think any political party would actually go for that, and I don't think it's actually. I think Scottish homes serve two very different functions, and I suggested earlier. One was ministers could really connect down to a local scale through Scottish homes, if and when they wanted to. But they really, and I think there are other ways of doing that, and that was why I was suggesting, in terms of sharpening delivery, you decentralise this to a disaggregated regional partnership level, and within that context, hopefully a combined regional authority would have a critical delivery vehicle for implementing change, which would be politically accountable at that scale. One of the criticisms of Scottish Homes, which was always a bit inaccurate. But the other key things it did were high-level discussion. We would have the Secretary for Scottish Development Department visit us with a couple of colleagues twice a year and talk to the board about what they thought ministers wanted. And that was it. They would say, broadly, this is what we want you to do. And broadly, we would do some of it, we'd do some other things. But that was a system in which that was allowed to happen because there was high-level housing expertise. There was real professionals on the technical side, on the finance side, the market analysis side, on organisational issues, and that was available across the housing sector, and particularly to the non-profit sector. I mean, with all due respect, and I'm not, this isn't an argument against the civil servants that are there now, but they don't have these skills. That because they're generic civil servants and they move around a lot, and good for them in their careers, do a great job. They just don't know about the housing system, to put it bluntly.
Yeah, I think if I can pick up on the why the lack of courage point and then come back to something that Gordon said earlier and basically what Callum was saying as well. I think I wear different hats. One of those hats is being in a sort of lobbying space. And I think one of the things that we talk about a lot is trying to argue that government should make an enabling context for all of the things that we need to see for housing, and they need to stop working in silos. And I think that that's true, and I think the report argues for some changes on how we can improve it. I think those criticisms could equally be turned back at those of us that are housing policy advocates. We work quite a lot in silos, and like Callum said, there's a lot of really good research in this space, but we don't do the work of making sense of it in the way that I think that we could. I understand implicitly sometimes that it can be a useful tactic to be quite critical of government, but I also think those of us that are working in spaces where we have the research, we have the expertise, and we really want to see change, could we look at maybe the way that we work together and how we work with government to be an enabling context ourselves? As Duncan said in the report, expertise doesn't necessarily lie within the civil service in the way that we would hope it does. We know where it is, though. So I think there is something to be said for the ways in which those of us that are in an advocacy space can take the knowledge that we have and the changes we want to see and make that as easy and friendly for government as we can without losing, our role of holding them to account as well.
That's great, thanks, Jocelyn. I'm going to come to another question because I'm aware of time. We want to get in as many as possible, so the microphone's already been deployed.
All right, I'm going to stand up with me. So I'm Leslie Marion Cameron, I was going to say beleaguered housing convener, I'm not, but I'm approaching my first year in that role for Edinburgh and former convener of economic development. Thank you very much for the report. I'm a huge believer in being disruptive. A couple of things I want to say, but I have a question that's very to the point, but my question just in response, I mean, I think I've had discussions with lots of people in this room. In response to what Ken said about education contributions, you're right to a point. However, as an authority, we have a lot of schools that need rebuilding and replacing. Liberton High School in my own ward, so there is a need for education contributions. Two things that I would support is looking at relaxing the affordable housing percentage in order to try and encourage development to grow. But what frustrates me, and I suppose what my question is why on earth, and I've lived in Australia for a bit and kind of observed how the development world and worked in it over there. In a country like this, when COVID hit, you know, rallied to make things, happen. Why on earth does it take a small country so long to do anything about this situation, about this housing emergency? Now, for those of you who know me and met me, I'm a doer, I'm not a sitter and talker, and I get hugely frustrated that things aren't coming together to make things happen. So my question is, why is that? And do you think that devolution has got in the way of being a bit more proactive and getting in the way? There's just so many departments, there's so many networks, there's so many groups, there's so many organisations to get around in this space. Because I, for one, as an elected member, I'm up for it, and I know there are other people like me. I think I've made my point. I hope so. I hope I've asked my question clearly anyway.
Great to have the local authority point of view. It's a question about pace. It was a question about frustration. It linked to devolution as well. So again, if we can have quick responses from the panel, and we'll move on to our next question to get as many in as possible.
I was a strong believer in devolution to the formation of the Scottish Parliament, and I still support that. I don't think it's worked out as well as it might have. And one of the things is there should have been consequent devolution within Scotland. It was double devolution was the phrase that David Miliband actually stole from a Canadian report. But in that context, so much of policy has been centralised back to Scottish Government. I'll give you an example. When local housing system analysis and the precursors to Honda's were developed, first thought of by the Scottish Development Department about 1985-86 was the first idea. Part of the idea was giving that down to councils to do it so that they would start thinking about not just council housing, but the other bits. So what does the Scottish Government do? They centralise it back to Victoria Quay. So that's one example, but there are so many where in terms of making housing work in the kind of relational way I want, so that it relates to plans, it relates to the economy and so on, there's not the knowledge in the system in Edinburgh. There never is at remote levels. You actually have to make these joins at the local scale. And you also have to leave space for the joins to be made differently. That was a great lesson I took out of listening to the Lar Trust example. It had some discretion to do stuff that non-profits never had. So I would say to you, yeah, I would be frustrated too, but why I want key decision-taking down at a more local scale is actually, nowadays, people have argued that devolution should be there so that people can politicians and others express their more local preferences. I think that's part of it. But the key thing is they can see connections, they can see evolutions, they can see change in a constantly changing world that a higher level of government just can't see.
Great. Would anyone on the panel, I think, Anne, if you could just come in briefly, that would be fantastic.
Thank you. So a couple of points in response to your queries. Firstly, cost of time is not recognised particularly well across the public sector. It is in the private sector because time is money. And I think if there were more targets and more targets were met on and resources given so that planning authorities didn't just have one person dealing with contamination, roads, whatever it is, and they had the budgets to deal with that, that would greatly improve the system. You also made a comment about the affordable housing targets. 25%, 35% of new developments have to be built for affordable housing. How about we reduce that to 7%, 8%, but the houses have to come in for free. So developers don't need to tie up with a housing association. They don't need to wait for a grant. That percentage of houses go for free, and the grant that would have attached to the 25% is given to the housing association, the charity or whatever, to do market deals and buy houses in the way that LAR has.
It's a very different way of thinking, which is what we wanted. So, next question.
Stuart Hay from the Royal Island Corporation of Architects in Scotland. I think we're in a dangerous time. There's a poly crisis. There's probably other elements to this. We've got the numbers that we need to hit, but there's also the quality. And do we really know what quality looks like in housing anymore is really my question. And it kind of taps into MPF 4 about the uncertainties that creates. If we know what needs to be delivered, it can be delivered, but I'm not sure that MPF 4 does that. And I think there's some elements of the existing stock we need to take into account of this, where we've made mistakes in the past. We've got RAC crisis, we've got the aftermath of Grenfell, and we've got lots of voids. And the voids are there because we built houses that aren't lettable because they're not the right type of houses in the right places.
So, question on quality. Who would like to take that one from the panel?
I could agree more with you that houses that are built for rent should be of adequate quality, but I don't think they should be gold-plated. I think I was asked at the Scottish Parliament when one local authority had produced 2 houses for £586,000, was that value for money? I actually suggested that it should have been a claim for maladministration on the part of that local authority, wasting public funds. We have a shortage of homes, and we have a shortage of homes now. We need more homes. We don't need gold-plated homes. They must be fit for purpose, and they should be meet the requirements that are necessary. Just answering just a couple of the points that was made earlier about delivery. We don't have the skill sets in most local authorities to undertake most of the things, but back in the days of regionalisation, there was local knowledge and there was local issues addressed. And a return to more localisation at a regional level would make a huge difference. Because currently, economic development is a fourth-tier responsibility within most local authorities. So we don't have economics as an issue that's to the forefront in the current 32 authorities. In England, they used Homes England. It had a budget of £365 million a year, but on average, Margaret Ford was able to lever in about £2 billion worth of economic benefit when they were parachuted into the various local authorities because they had the expertise to help the local authority deliver issues relating in particular to housing. We may have to do something like that as a stopgap until more knowledge is at a local level. But we need more homes and we need them now. We don't need gold-plated homes.
So I'm going to go to Jocelyn very briefly. Go on, Callum.
The quality of our new build affordable housing in Scotland has never been higher, quite frankly. I attended an event during the course of the week, and the raft of projects from Water Road to the Gorbals to Western Bartonshire Council, I think you were referring to there, Ken, where we actually build them. Remarkable array of construction capability and talent. Ultimately, the delivery of affordable homes really comes down in terms of the quality of the product. To have our collaborators understand the available suite of finance at their disposal and to align that capability with design talent, the architects who are delivering it. But I would certainly say that what we're delivering now is as good as I've seen within my career.
Jocelyn.
I'll be very brief just on the sort of existing homes space. I think one of the things that, is an undercurrent of this whole report, but it's thinking about the whole system and thinking about how we improve housing outcomes across that system. So I agree with Callum's point entirely in terms of we have good quality new build supply, and I think we have a set of a framework, maybe too many frameworks, and I would argue we need much longer term clarity on exactly what regulations we're supposed to meet. But existing supply is very much a part of tackling the housing challenges that we do have. And I think that's something that is not maybe explicitly in the report, but is very much an undercurrent of it. I think retrofit is really important. I think nonprofits and their retrofit are really important. So just to acknowledge that, yes, the existing stock and making sure that we have people that are not having their health and well-being undermined by being in poor stock. I think in terms of bringing that into the sort of homelessness space as well, we need to think about temporary accommodation and what that's doing to people's well-being as well. And if that's not only good quality, but suitable housing for the people that we have. So I think your question is very much an important one. Existing supply is important as well, but I think it underscores why we're arguing for a system-wide approach to these things, because it's not just about increasing new build supply. It would be great if we could make more houses every year, construct more houses every year, but if the existing homes that we have are not fit for purpose, we're failing in a different way in the same housing system.
Thank you. So we're going to come to our next question. So if you're holding the microphone, go ahead.
Hello, my name's Keith Anderson. I spent over 40 years in the housing world, and there are two things which still haunt me about those years. One is the right to buy policy and the unintended consequences of that, whereby we find in Scotland probably about 50% of the private rented sector is former council housing. That was an unintended, that is not property owning democracy in my view. The second is the deregulatory slide, which has resulted, I think, pretty directly in what we saw in Grenfell. Never again should we allow that to happen. So there's a thing called good regulation and there's a thing called bad regulation. And so I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater in just dissing regulation, because we need it. The market on its own, as we've known for a very long time, including Adam Smith, cannot cope on its own, does not have the moral discipline on its own, and therefore needs intervention to manage it appropriately, especially when we have the need for economic and social outcomes. My question in all of this is, how do we scale up what we know and can demonstrate has been successful? So I would like to see, how can we scale up, Anne, before you leave LAR, write up how that can be scaled up for the whole of Scotland, so that mid-market rent can be delivered without grant for the whole of Scotland. Therefore, no grant needed for social rent, which is our greatest need. And in an attempt to manage cost increases, scale up modern methods of construction. So I've always been extremely impressed at the work that Callum has done with CCG over the years. I would like to see that done many times over. How can that be done? That would address the skills issues as well.
That was a huge question. So we've covered good regulation versus bad regulation, scaling up, modern methods of construction, how can we make law happen? So I think what I will do is ask, if we start at this end close to me, and perhaps we can ask for and I do mean it, quick fire from each of you on any part of that question you want to pick up on.
Thank you. Firstly, regulation, totally agree. It's about good governance, necessary governance, appropriate governance, rather than layers and layers and layers of governance that just slow things down. On our website, you'll find Phase 1 key outputs from LAR, and that tells you exactly how we did it. Anybody can copy it. All the metrics are there, so I really hope it is scaled up. Thank you.
I think I agree with your premise, Keith. I think we need a balanced approach to anything. I think in Scotland we saw with the emerging cost of living legislation, we focused so much on affordability. So if that was a crisis, and overly regulating one part of the housing system, and then we forgot about the need to invest. Actually, the housing system needs a balance. We need supply, we need standards, and we need affordability. We need to find a regulated system that's proportionate to driving improvements across that. And I think fundamentally, yeah, let's look at the model of LAR, let's look at modern methods of construction, find ways to try and address the cost of delivering homes, because obviously inflation has went up incredibly, as well as trying to grow the pie and get more investment.
I'll tackle the MMC question, Keith. In terms of sustaining that going forward, what we need are long-term pipelines of activity with the necessary sustained financial support and commitment to innovation going forward. Without that, the industry will not change.
Keith, your question is well made. the solution I would put forward, or a solution that would help to get it across the whole of Scotland, is to address local housing allowances. Housing allowances vary so dramatically, but the bricks and mortar cost the same. If anything, they cost more in the rural areas than they do in the conurbations. But the rent achieved, for example, a 4-bed in the Borders is 950. In East Lothian, just across the border, it's 2,180 per month. Therefore, the rent received is dramatically different and can be viable. If it was averaged out at similar to the Lothians and Greater Glasgow for the whole of the country, it would enable the private sector to invest and deliver at local housing allowance. And bear in mind, local housing allowances in Scotland were changed, other than the rest of England and Wales or the rest of the UK, where it is paid direct to the household, direct to the provider. And this keeps a roof over the heads of people when they have to apply under universal credits for local housing allowance. It's a very important thing. Therefore, the institutions don't have bad debt in Scotland, the same as they have south of the border. But trying to address local housing allowance, as Duncan has mentioned in his report, would help enormously butter it out across the whole country.
Thanks. I'll take a few of the things. I agree entirely with the points that Callum the First has made in terms of MMC. What I will say, though, coming from a place where I work quite a lot in the construction space, MMC will fix some of the skills challenges that we have, not all of them. So we really still do need to think, again, to the point made in the report about a whole of government approach, we need some changes in the way that we train people that are going to be building houses and maintaining houses if we're going to address the skills gap that we have. Yeah, I think, again, in terms of the sort of unintended consequences of previous housing policies, and I'll say nothing more specific, I think it also underscores some of the points that are made in the report about having impact statements of both housing and non-housing ministry decisions and what those outcomes will be. I think that's a really good part of sort of improving governance and governing moving forward is thinking through what the possible consequences will be and then mitigating the negative ones. And just, yeah, to say, in terms of regulations and things like cladding and RAC and some of the other issues that I see forthcoming in terms of maintenance in particular in tenements, homes need to be affordable and they need to be of good quality, but they also need to be safe. So just to say, yeah, I think I agree with you entirely in terms of we need good regulation that makes sense, but it's not the absence of regulation.
We need to wrap up. We're fast running out of time.
I'm going to throw in that in those 3 questions, the panel will have to combine all their answers. I'd also like to ask Anne and Callum Murray, in your answers, can you mention the work you do on skills? Because no one's mentioned that today, and I think you're both working in different ways on how to do that. So, Chris.
Yeah.
Duncan, can you save your comments for the end? Because I want you to have the last word. And if you speak now, no one else will get those last 3 questions.
Well, I think Keith had a misperception about the report.
Okay.
We weren't arguing for a market-only solution. In fact, it's pretty explicit if you read section 3 that we need an efficient market and we also need a non-profit sector.
I haven't read it yet.
Well, it's always a good idea to keep, quote Adam Smith, even at a David Hume meeting, but you need to give some reason to that passion as well.
Quick 5 questions and answers.
Yeah, Chris Cook. I spent 15 years, I was asked by Lord Reid to look into resilient financial systems, physical systems, starting from the 2008 crash. And I observe a transition from a capital-intensive, resource-intensive economy to a services economy. And what does that look like? That's one point. The services economy is not a buy, borrow, build, and depart model. We're looking at different instruments. We're looking at different agreements. So that's the first point. Second point, the Danes got energy right. And I know you're interested in this specifically. For 50 years, post the oil shock, they have been procuring not at least financial cost, but at least carbon fuel cost. That is not explicitly said anywhere, but procurement in that way now makes economic sense because the higher the oil price goes, the more profit there is in saving it. So we've seen a pivot essentially in the state of markets that makes it more economic than not to save energy. And that is a huge point. I used to be a director of a global energy exchange, but I'm better now, is what I tell people. I'll stop there.
And quickly run over here. So David, and then the chap behind you.
Yeah, a very quick question. Should we offer Angela Rayner political asylum in Scotland and put her in charge of planning reform, and perhaps in combo with Professor Mulbauer for taxation?
Thank you. David Rain, Homes for Scotland, and I wanted to respond to some of the comments about regulation and agree with colleagues on the panel, which is that we need regulation to ensure that homes are affordable, that they're of good quality. But homes that we're building in Scotland are currently attaining a 75% reduction in carbon emissions since 1990. They're warm, they're affordable, they're secure, and people are buying them, and people are renting them. But you have to look at reviewing regulation because it might not be fit for purpose. A piece of work that we're currently doing with the Scottish Government is looking at road bonds regulation. It's from the 1980s. It slows down the development and delivery of housing and is massively affecting SMEs. Elsewhere, the look to a passive house regulation, not wanted by the majority of householders in Scotland, could add at least £8,000 to the cost of building a home. That will go on mortgages, that will go on tenants' bills, and it's most likely to reduce the number of homes that are built for first-time buyers, starter homes, and marginal areas.
Okay, so again, we've got changing economies, changing markets, political asylum for Angela Rayner, skills, we're going to talk about skills as well, and we're going to talk about regulation again, passive house equivalents, and we're going to do this in just 4 minutes. So when I said quickfire, I really do mean it. And perhaps if we start again with Anne, and last words working towards Duncan, who's going to wrap up in fewer than 4 minutes.
The Angela Rayner question, £2.5 billion for low interest rate loans in England. Brilliant if we could have that up in Scotland. I think it would really help finance a lot more affordable homes. In terms of skills and development, it is really challenging these days to find people with the appropriate skills, particularly if you're doing refurbishment of old listed buildings who are stonemasons, who have the right skills. Certainly at LAR, we've hosted modern apprentices. We frequently have school kids in who are finishing up school who want to see what it's like in the workplace. So I think the more that universities and particularly colleges can do to increase the workforce with these traditional skills and ground workers, joiners, sparkies, the whole lot, then the better, because there aren't enough.
So David, I would agree with you, but we need proportionate regulation. You don't want to over-regulate, and that's ridiculous. You want to have a buoyant market, you want to have increased supply, but it needs to be proportionate. And I agree with your point on probably passive house. I think it makes it. But what we don't want to do is start, just as I said earlier, just picking out our things that we don't like. If we're having, if we're in the spirit of this, looking systems wide. Actually, let's look at how we build a new system, not just pick out the ones that any individual one of us think. And I think broadly on skills, construction skills are absolutely crucial, but the housing sector is more than just those who are building the homes, it's they're managing and looking after people. So let's encourage people to enter the housing profession in systems wide. Let's make housing like an ambitious career choice, because you can do literally anything in the housing sector, from building it, to manage it, to customer service, to tech and IT. It has that variety. Actually, we should be talking much more about the totality of what a housing system offers people as a career choice. The more talent we've got in the sector, the easier our future problems will be.
CCG introduced the elimination of waste, inefficiency into our business to deliver off-site modern methods of construction, specifically because we recognise that going forward, our products were going to change. The thermal efficiency that is now being demands a different level of skill set and mindset through that process. Despite the fact we've gone down that route, we did not eliminate the traditional skill set from within our business. We've supported year on year for the last 2 decades up to 30 apprenticeships across joinery, bricklaying and electrical skills within our sites. It's a remarkable commitment. It really comes down to leadership within our organisation. Fundamentally from the top, We've driven that aspect of our business under the need to change, the need to recognise change within the industry. And quite frankly, others need to do the same going forward. We have an ageing population. It ain't going to change. And quite simply, they need to rise to the challenge.
CCG have been an exemplar in our sector for decades. The Wiley family have put their money where their mouths are. Callum has managed it and delivered magnificently for many communities. Two things I would just leave you with. North of Inverness right now, Scottish and Southern Energy and Scottish Power are looking for 1,000 homes for building trades operatives to bring renewable energy to market. They don't need skills, they need homes. Same thing is going to be happening shortly in East Lothian as the Berwick Bank wind farm lands at Skate Raw. And the work that's going to be done down there is going to make a huge difference eventually in making our energy very sustainable and produced from sustainable means. The one thing I would leave you with is I would advocate what Duncan has put into his paper and his report, that housing becomes within government a cabinet secretary position and an individual responsible not just for housing but for planning and infrastructure. When we do that, we have got a chance of delivering the homes that Scotland needs.
Thanks. I think as somebody who comes from a context where I'm also looking at Canada quite a lot, as Duncan's mentioned, there are a lot of good examples of things that can change in housing policy from the Canadian experience. There are equally really bad examples of what can happen in housing policy from the Canadian experience. So I think to the point that Duncan made earlier about recognizing the skills and talents that you have in your politicians, I think there's equally a lot of hope to be had in the Scottish system. Duncan's outlined in the report as well. There have been significant periods of change, and Scotland has demonstrated its capacity to make bold, courageous change in order to improve housing outcomes. So I think that's my one big takeaway is, obviously I endorse the things that are in this report, but I think it's not feeling quite so hopeless and thinking Scotland does have a lot going for it. So I think we've demonstrated our capacity to be bold. I think we just need to encourage that moving forward.
So a note of hope, and then Duncan, if we can come to you for last words.
Okay. I think Angela Rayner might be better as Solicitor General rather than Housing Minister. I think she did a fantastic job in housing in England, actually. I've had my say in the course of doing this work. Invented a new word. The written version of the word rant is a rint. So I think that my paper, I got a lot off my chest. I'm not constrained by employment of any kind. I've always through my career tried to be honest about what I understood or what I thought was wrong and offered my advice, hopefully in a constructive way. I hope the paper is seen as being constructive, and I think that the big issues within it are leaving the rental sector, the market rented sector or private rented sector kind of alone when you do some tweaking and now get it running, rather than interfering a lot over the next 5 or 10 years, refocusing and re-galvanizing the non-profit sector. And within that, when Anne was talking about different finance models, absolutely, I think that that is absolutely critical, that it's not all about the grant, it's not all about the HAG, but allowing higher levels of HAG where it's needed. You don't house the poorest decile or poorest 15% of the population anywhere in Europe in decent housing unless you're anteing up 60-65% subsidy in the project, whether it's through income allowances, low interest loans, or grant rates. So start from that position when you're beginning to calculate the need. I do think the next most important thing is about looking at younger homeowners and routes into home ownership of different kinds and in different ways. and that takes us into the longer term agendas. I did suggest that many of the things I was talking about were for beyond the election. I've tried to sketch out what I think is a terrain of issues, and I do think the points that are made about the housing groups, housing lobbies, the housing in, although Adam Smith would be very concerned because he didn't like industry lobbies to get together. He said that they never had the interests of the public at heart when they did so, Keith. But I don't believe that in this case. I think that that's important to have that coherent. And remember, not only the palliative and the preventative and the productive, and get some better numbers on the table as you do that, particularly if there's resistance to repositioning housing more towards an economic orientation. I've pretty much had my say, and my last words are thank you.
So sadly, it's time to bring today's event to a close, but clearly there's still a lot of conversation to be had, so please stay for lunch so we can keep some of these discussions going. For those of you who've joined online, thank you, and I hope you found it an informative session. And before we go, Susan's asked me to remind you all that David Hume Institute events are free to attend, and they're open to everyone, and that is very much in line with the organisation's commitment to diversity of thought. And as a charity, this work is only possible thanks to donations, and so if you've enjoyed this morning's event, please do talk to Susan about how you can support further. And we'd like to thank everyone who's been involved with this research, but particularly CCG and the providers of that pro bono support that was mentioned earlier on. And finally, thank you to our speakers. Thank you to all of you for being such a brilliant audience. And thank you to the staff at Riddles Court for hosting us in this really quite lovely venue. So, yes, a huge thank you. We're incredibly grateful, and we hope that you all enjoy the rest of your day.